staying warm and dry as the winter season has kicked in, and of course, as always, just a reminder that all of our learning should be a zechut for all of OUisrael, specifically our chayalim and refuah shlema for all those who have been injured. It should be a segula that our hostages should come home speedily, and we should continue to remember that the power of our learning and of our davening can hopefully go a long way, Be'ezrat Hashem, in bringing good news to Am Yisrael. What we're going to do today is a bit of what I call a bit of a transitional shir. It's a little bit more technical than I think most of our shirim usually are, but I think it's part of the process of what we're doing. What we've been doing since what we've been doing the last couple of weeks was we started with a series on why we daven, and now my goal is to basically take you on a bit of a journey, trying to understand the process of how we got to what was initially commanded as part of the mitzvah of Tefila, and how we got to where we are today. So last week we discussed the major question of whether or not there is a mitzvah de Dorisa, a biblical commandment to daven, and we saw machloket between the Rambam and the Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides, regarding whether or not there is a mitzvah to daven. Is davening on a biblical level an opportunity or an obligation? And we analyzed that machloket, saw a number of different understandings regarding that machloket. And what I'd like to do this week and next week is try to get to, okay, so if there is a biblical obligation, which we saw is a machloket, but if there is a biblical obligation, how do we get to then what we do today, which is davening 3 times a day? And today is a bit of a transitional shir where most of the mefarshim and many of the commentaries seem to agree with the Rambam, which is that there is a biblical obligation to daven. That is the standard approach. We saw not everyone agrees. The Ramban, Nachmanides, does not agree. But many of the Mefarshim and many of the commentaries seem to assume, like the Rambam, that there is a biblical obligation to daven. So then the question becomes, if there is a biblical obligation to daven, how many times a day biblically am I obligated to daven? Meaning, was 3 times a day a biblical obligation? Is it midoraita? Or did that develop later on? And that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to explore a number of different positions regarding, as I wrote here, Tefila de Oraita, how many times daily? If we agree with the Rambam, if we agree with Maimonides, which many Mefarshim do, that there is a biblical obligation to daven, the question then becomes, how do we define, how do we magdir what exactly that obligation is? And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to see a few different opinions regarding how many times daily we may be obligated biblically to daven. Now, if you were here last week, you may be thinking to yourselves, wait a second, we already know the answer to that question, because the Rambam, who we saw last week, answers that question. And that's what we're going to start with. The first opinion, and probably the main opinion regarding this question, is that of the Rambam. And the Rambam, as we're going to see in a minute, and as we did see last week as well, the Rambam is of the opinion that on a biblical level, mid oraisa, the only amount of time that you have to daven every single day is how often? And remember, once a day. Once a day. The biblical obligation, according to the Rambam, is that on a daily basis, a person should make sure to pray to God, to daven to Hashem once a day. Let's look at source number 1. We're going to see it again because it's very fundamental to everything that we're doing. Says the Rambam in source number 1, Mitzvat aseh lehitpalel bechol yom. It is a positive obligation, a positive commandment to daven every day. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, Ve'avadtem et Hashem Elokeichem, and you should serve Hashem your God. Mipi hashmu'a lamdu she'avodah zu hi tefila. We learn from the Torah, from the oral law, that the avodah that's referenced in this pasuk refers to tefila, to davening. Shene'emar, how do we know? Because the pasuk in Shema says, Uli avdo b'chol levavchem, you should serve God with all of your heart. Amru chachamim, Ezuhi avodah shebelev. What is this avodah shebelev? What does it mean? B'chol levavchem zu tefila. Okay, so these are the sources we've seen before. We see from these sources that there is a biblical obligation to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu every single day. Continues the Rambam, the underlined part. Ve'en minyan hatfilot min haTorah. There is no set amount of davening that you have to do biblically. Ve'en mishaneh hatfila hazot, and there's no repetition, or there's no specific min haTorah. There's no specific definition, or hagdara is the right word. I'm losing my English. Forgive me. There is no specific parameters. Parameters is probably the best word for davening min haTorah. Ve'ein litfilah zman kavua min haTorah. There's also no set time. According to the Rambam, the mitzvah is davening once a day. When you daven, what you say, and how often you do it is up to you. It just means you should do it once a day. Continues the Rambam, source number 2. Ulefikach, therefore, because it is not something that is time-bound, min de'oraisa, nashim ve'avadim chayavim b'tefila. This is the Rambam's opinion. We're going to hopefully see this at some point. We'll explore a little bit more of the obligation of women in davening. But the opinion of the Rambam is that since min de'oraisa, biblically there is no time that you have to daven, that means it is not considered a time-bound mitzvah. And if it's not a time-bound mitzvah, then women are also obligated in it as well. Lefi shehi mitzvah aseh shelo hazman grama. It is a mitzvah aseh that is not time-bound. Elachiv mitzvah zukach. This is the mitzvah, says the Rambam. What is the biblical mitzvah to daven? Sheyehei adam mitchanen umitpalel bekol yom. You should plead and daven to Hashem every day. Umagid shivcho shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You should praise Him every single day. V'achar kach shoel tzrachav. And then you should ask for the things that you need. Shehu tzarich lahem bevakasha uv'tachana. With requests. V'achar kach noten shevach. So you should start with praise. Then you go to request. And then you go to thanks. And someone pointed out last week that what is the Rambam describing? Where do we see this order? In our Shemona Esrei, that's exactly what we do. We begin Shemona Esrei, which is the main tefillah we begin with praise. Then we move on to bakasha. And then we move on to thanks. Okay, there's nothing more beautiful than hearing the sound of wonderful children. So I apologize let's keep that perspective in mind. I will try to be louder, but to hear the voices of beautiful children there's nothing we can never take that for granted. Okay. Halacha Gimel continues the Rambam in defining how he understands the mitzvah. Im haya ragil marbe b'tachana ubakasha. If he's somebody who's used to davening, who davens all the time, then you can daven a lot of times. Ve'im haya arel sfatayim. And if you're somebody who's just, you have trouble speaking, or you're not the kind of person that talks a lot, then medaber kifi yicholto. Then daven as much as you want, whatever you want to say. Uvechol eis sheyirtzeh, whenever you want, whatever you want. V'chein minyan tefilot kol echad yafi yicholto. Same thing regarding the amount of time. Everybody should do what works for them based on their abilities. Yesh mitpalel pam echat. There will some that will daven once a day. V'yesh mitpalel pa'amim harbe. Some will daven more depending on their personality. There are some people who just naturally will feel that connection, that desire to daven, and there were some who will do with one time a day. V'akol yumut palalim nochach hamikdash. And he does add that when you daven, you should daven facing the Beit Hamikdash, b'kol makom, wherever you are, b'kol makom she'yeh. V'chein haya davar tamid mimoshe Rabbeinu ad Ezra. And this is the way it was, says the Rambam. This was the mitzvah from Moshe, the biblical commandment, until all the way down to Ezra. And as we're going to see, hopefully in future weeks, once Ezra comes along, the way that we envision davening changed. The way that davening was changed dramatically. So according to the Rambam, the mitzvah is, if we were to ask, what is the biblical mitzvah to daven? According to the Rambam, it's once a day, whenever you want, whatever you want. Now, many of the Mefarshim try to understand where the Rambam got this from. Okay, it's one thing to say that the Rambam understood because there's a pasuk in the Torah that you can interpret to say that it means that there's a mitzvah to daven. To say that there's a mitzvah to daven makes sense. How does the Rambam know that it's only once a day? Where does he get that from? There's no explicit source in the Torah. And so the Mefarshim on the Rambam try to understand where he got this from. So look at source number 2. Source number 2 is the Kesef Mishnah. The Kesef Mishnah is one of the main commentaries on the Rambam, actually written by Rav Yosef Cairo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch and the author of the Beis Yosef. He wrote one of his first works was a commentary on the Rambam, the Kesef Mishnah, and he says the following. Source number 2, Vida'as Rabbeinu. Where does the Rambam get shemitzvat aseh min haTorah litpalel b'kol yom? Where does he get this idea that it's once a day? Why not once a week? Why not 5 times a day? Where does the Rambam get this from? So he says he gets it from Imashe Katav v'avadetem et Hashem. The source is from the fact that the Torah refers, or the Rambam understands the Tefila to be connected to avodah. Says the Kesef Mishnah, avodah zu tzricha liot b'kol yom. It makes sense that if you're referring to a service to God, in order for you to have a meaningful service to God, how often should that be? There should be consistency to it. what would be a base of consistency? Every single day. Says the Kesef Mishnah. Why? Because if not, if you don't define it as every day, because you have a choice. If you're going to say that there's no real definition, then maybe you would suggest, okay, a person can daven once in their entire lifetime. Is that called avodah? Is that called service to God? No. Service to God has to be consistent. And if we were to ask what's the most basic form of consistency, the Rambam understood in order to have a basic form of service to a higher being, the Rambam understood that has to be every single day. To say that it's only once in your lifetime makes no sense. And therefore the Rambam picked the most basic form of what we would call avodah, service, and he interpreted it to be every single day. The Imkain al Korchach concludes the Kesef Mishnah. Hachiyuv hu lehitpalel b'kol yom. The obligation must be to daven every single day. Aval in minyan tefilot min Torah. But how many times a day? That's not midoraita. Ela pa'am achat bayom sagi. Once a day. Okay, so the Kesef Mishnah's basic explanation is, where did the Rambam get this from? Logic. The Rambam connects it to the avodah, to our service to God. If you want someone to have a consistent service to somebody, how often would that need to be? Every day makes sense, because otherwise you're leaving it up to a person's mood, once a week, once a month, and therefore the Rambam understood it to be, if it's part of our overall avodat Hashem, once a day makes sense. That's the Kesef Mishnah's interpretation. However, there's another beautiful interpretation of the Kiryat Sefer. The Kiryat Sefer is another commentary on the Rambam, not one that's on the actual text of the Rambam, so he's a little bit less well known. And he understands it to be based on one of the psukim that the Rambam brings for the source to daven. Look at source number 3. Says the Kiryat Sefer, Uma shekatav harav zal demin haTorah b'kol yom chayav. Regarding the Rambam's opinion that midoraisa, every day you are obligated, efshar disamich asofei dikra. It must be based on the fact that one of the psukim that the Rambam quotes as the source for the concept of davening is a pasuk that we've quoted. What is the pasuk? The pasuk says that if you daven, v'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem, uveirach et lachmecha ve'et meimecha. That if you daven to Hashem, Hashem will then provide you with water and with bread. If you look at source number 5, I brought you the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ve'avadetem et Hashem Elokechem uveirach et lachmecha ve'et meimecha v'asiroti machalam b'kirbecha." The pasuk says, if you serve Hashem, then Hashem will give you water and bread and take away all illness. Says the Kiryat Sefer the following idea: the source for davening, one of the sources, is the pasuk that compares davening to receiving food. Says the Kiryat Sefer, the Rambam used logic. How often does a person need to eat? Once a day. And therefore, if you need to eat once a day, and that's the pasuk that's being brought, the Rambam concluded that therefore davening is once a day. As the Kiryat Sefer concludes, Dehu tzorech kol yom. This is a need every single day. Hachanami tefila b'kol yom. So too, davening is every single day. Now, those of you who are thinking, excellent, good, excellent. We usually eat 3 times a day. In Israel, you eat 5 times a day because you have aruchat eser and then you have snack, right? It's like, we're eating a lot. So that's good, excellent. So the truth is, some are going to question this specifically based on your point. Because wait a second, we eat 3 times a day. Or even if we don't say 3 times a day, back in the times of the Gemara, it was usually understood that they would eat 2 times a day. So there are some that are going to actually question this source based on that. But that's the Kiryat Sefer. The Kiryat Sefer seems to understand that it's basically like, how much do you need to function on a daily basis? Eat once a day. And if you eat once a day, that's also how much you need to daven. Yes. So it's an excellent question. There's no question that the word avaditem in the general context refers to avodat Hashem. So first of all, I think you're number one. It's because what many people point to is what we mentioned in the Rambam, which is that in another pasuk it says ve'avaditem v'chol lavchem v'chol nafshechem, and the Gemara says what avodah is b'chol lavchem. Which avodah do you do with all of your leiv? That's tefillah. So meaning, At least in the pasuk where it says, that seems to clearly be referring to davening. And then other people will say, well, once that avodah refers to tefillah, this one does too. But I would say even more than that. I think you're right. Because if you remember last week, we noted how the Rambam, when he lists in the Sefer HaMitzvos, he lists the mitzvah to daven. He doesn't phrase it as mitzvah number 5 is to daven. What does he say? Mitzvah number 5 is la'avod et Hashem, to serve Hashem. To serve Hashem in all of what it means. But he said the expression of how we do that is davening. Meaning, there's no question that avodah could also mean korbanot, it could mean doing all the mitzvot, it could be all of that. But the way we're understanding it is that tefillah is one of the main expressions of how we show that avodah. Although I agree that I think the Rambam would suggest that tefillah is meant to be seen as not just its own mitzvah, but as part of our overall framework for avodat Hashem. So I think it's a good question, but I think it's based on those two things. Number one, that elsewhere it says b'chol levavchem, which seems to indicate davening. Number two, I think it is part of an overall framework, but because of the pasuk of b'chol levavchem, they believe it to be referring specifically a unique expression of davening. But I think it is part. I think one of the most important things we have to remember is that davening is meant to, in the end of the day, not be seen in a vacuum, but is meant to enhance everything we do. It's meant to enhance all of our tefillah. It's meant to enhance the way we approach life. It's meant to enhance the way we do the rest of our mitzvot. It's meant to enhance our ben adam lachavero. That's what davening is meant to be, that time, as we've spoken about, where we're able to take a step back and remind ourselves of what's important. And I think that's crucial. Excellent question. Again, the question was, if b'chol vavchem refers to tefillah, then what does it mean? The continuation of the pasuk is b'chol nafshechem uv'chol meodchem. So it's a very good question. When the Mefarshim quote the pasuk, they focus more on the levavchem. But I think what they're saying is exactly your point, which is uli avdo, you should serve him b'chol levavchem, b'chol nafshechem. Forgive me if I'm not getting the exact words. You're supposed to serve him in all of those ways. Livavcha refers to tefillah. Nafshecha might refer to something else. And meodecha might refer to something else. They're all referring to different types of avodah. But what's clear is you have a biblical commandment, or at least according to the Rambam, to serve God b'chol livavcha, which is tefillah. It could be nafshecha means something else. It could mean mitzvot. It could mean midot. It could mean all different types of things. It's a very good question. But I think that's the point, is that there are different aspects to it. Yes? That's 100%. I think the fact that they call it avodah shebelev absolutely points to the fact, and that's true, that fundamentally tefillah is not meant to be just a physical action, but it's meant to be coming from the heart. Correct. Yes, 100%. And many people talk about that. I don't know remember if we mentioned this or not, but Rav Soloveitchik talks about how there are some mitzvot where there's what's called the ma'aseh mitzvah, the act of the mitzvah, and then there's the kiyum, the fulfillment of the mitzvah. Okay, very often the kiyum and the ma'aseh are the same. When you shake the lulav, you do the ma'aseh, you do the action, and as you do the action, you fulfill the mitzvah. Then there are certain mitzvot where there's the act of the mitzvah, and then the way you fulfill it. What example does he bring? He brings the example of tshuva. Okay, there's the action you do of ashamti, bagaditi, gadalt, all the things that we've done. But what's real tshuva? Feeling it inside. So there's the ma'aseh, and then there's the kiyum. The same thing is with tefillah. What's the ma'aseh mitzvah of tefillah? What's the action we do of tefillah? Saying the words. But what's the real kiyum, the real fulfillment of the mitzvah? The kavanah. What we think about. You're 100% correct that the fact that they call it avodah shebelev already tells us what tefillah is all about. Yes, 100%. 100%. Okay, so we've seen two explanations for the Rambam. How did he know that it was once a day? Either because logic, it's connected to avodah and you have to do avodah on a daily basis, or it's because the pasuk compares it to eating, and at least according to the fundamental, this approach, eating is done on a daily basis. Go on your day, that already sets the tone. Absolutely. Although, as we're going to see in the future, when we talk about, hopefully next week, we talk about the idea, but the real basis behind davening 3 times a day, we need reminders throughout the day. You're 100% correct that part of why we start with Moda Ani is that it sets the tone, and that's why Shacharis is done. That's why the first tefillah has to be in the morning before you do anything else. But the reason you need more than that is because at the end of the day, the further we go from our davening, the less we stay connected, and that's the idea behind mincha and Mariv. But yes, that's a very, very good point. In source number 4, I brought you a perush from Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlo. Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlo was a rav in Poland in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a halachic posek, and he wrote a commentary on Rav Sadia Gaon's list of the mitzvot. We mentioned last week that there are many, that everyone agrees that there are 613 mitzvot, but there is a big machloket, there's a big argument as to what those 613 are. So the Rambam was the one who wrote the most famous, has this, what's called the Sefer HaMitzvot, where he lists all the mitzvot. The Sefer HaChinuch is another commentary that wrote a list of the 613 mitzvot, and one of the other well-known ones was Rav Sadia Gaon. Rav Sadia Gaon, who also has a commentary on the Chumash, and was a well-known philosopher, he also has a list of his 613 mitzvot. The challenge with his list is that it's very, very, very concise. We're going to see an example of it soon. He does list Tefila as one of his 613 mitzvot, but it's very concise and there's no commentary on it. Comes Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlo, who was a halachic Rav, a posek in Poland in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he writes this tremendously detailed, long commentary on Rav Sadia Gaon's list of the mitzvot. And he has a whole analysis regarding this question of how many times biblically does a person need to daven every single day. He mentions the Rambam. We're going to see soon he argues on the Rambam. He disagrees with the Rambam. But one of these suggestions he makes is, where does the Rambam get this from? Where does the Rambam understand that it's based on every single day? He says, well, if you look at one of the psukim, the pasuk in Shema that we talked about before, it says, Ulavavdo b'chol vavchem b'chol nafshechem. Right before that, it talks about the mitzvah of that you should teach your children, which is a reference to what kind of mitzvah? The mitzvah of chinuch and of learning Torah. Says Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlo, it's the same pasuk that talks about limud Torah and talks about the mitzvah of davening. How often does a person need to daven every single day? He says once a day. And therefore, if you have to learn once a day, and in the same pasuk it talks about davening, the Rambam learned from there that you have to only daven once a day. That's Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlo's suggestion. Okay, so we have 3 interpretations. We didn't see it inside, but that's source number 4. 3 different interpretations. Where does the Rambam get this from? Where did the Rambam get from the concept that you only have to daven once a day biblically? Either it's because logic, as the Kesef Mishnah said, or it's because it's connected to eating in the pasuk, and we eat on a daily basis. Or the third interpretation is it's connected to tefillah, to learning Torah. And since there's a commandment to learn Torah every single day, so too there is a mitzvah to daven every single day. That is the first opinion that we've seen so far. That's the Rambam. Okay, so the first opinion that we've seen regarding how often a person needs to daven, that is the Rambam. However, as I mentioned before, Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlo, in his commentary on Rav Sadia Gaon, disagrees fundamentally with the Rambam. He thinks there is a biblical commandment to daven twice a day, that you actually have to daven twice a day. Where does he get this from? So the main source for this concept is source number 7. We're going to skip the source number 6 for now. Source number 7. Now, source number 7 is a Mishnah and a Gemara that is very, very detailed. And for the sake of clarity, we're not going to go into the specifics of this Gemara and this Mishnah because it's a very confusing sugya. But trust me when I just basically say in summary, the Gemara is discussing when a person needs to daven mincha and when a person needs to daven what we call ne'ilah. Now you're thinking ne'ilah. We only have ne'ilah on Yom Kippur. The truth was that in the times of the Gemara, there were other times that they would daven ne'ilah. When else did they daven ne'ilah? Anyone know? On a fast day, exactly. On a fast day. The minhag was whenever there were not the fast days that we know of, but there used to be public fast days if there wasn't any rain. If there was any kind of tragedy or there wasn't rain, then the rabbis of the community would declare a fast day, and they would daven ne'ilah on those days as well. So the Gemara is discussing the obligation to daven mincha, and it's also discussing the obligation to daven ne'ilah. And the Gemara differentiates and says, in a certain case, you should daven mincha, but you don't daven ne'ilah. Again, without getting into all the details of the specific case, the Gemara says you should daven mincha, you shouldn't daven ne'ilah. Asks the Gemara in source number 7, where it says kol yom sheyesh bo halel, it's the Gemara part. We're skipping the Mishnah for now. Kol yom sheyesh bo halel ein bo mamad. Asks the Gemara, ma hefresh ben zelezeh. What's the difference? Why are you differentiating between mincha and between ne'ilah? Why are you saying that in this specific circumstance we should daven mincha, but we shouldn't daven ne'ilah? Answers the Gemara, halalu divrei Torah, vehalalu divrei sofrim. Because one of them is divrei Torah. What does divrei Torah literally mean? Biblical, midoraisa. And the other one is only divrei sofrim, which is usually a reference to midorabanan. So what the Gemara seems to do is differentiate between mincha, which is deoraita, which is biblical in nature, and ne'ilah, which even when we do say it on fast days is only dirabanan, it's only rabbinic. Look at Rashi and his interpretation. Halalu divrei Torah. What does it mean? Halalu. What is divrei Torah? What is deoraisa? Rashi says, what's midoraisa? Mincha. Davening mincha is midoraisa. Davening mincha is biblical. Where do we get that from? Kidamrina bebrachot, because we have a well-known Gemara in Brachot, which we're going to go over again today, but we've seen it. Many of you are familiar with it. The famous Gemara that talks about where do we get the idea of davening 3 times a day from. The machlokes is between whether it comes from the avot or it comes from the korbanot. Okay, if it comes from the avot, the Gemara itself brings psukim. What is the pasuk? What does the Gemara tell us? The Gemara brings the pasuk that Avram established shacharit, Yitzchak established mincha, and Yaakov established Mariv. And for each of those, the Gemara brings a pasuk. Look at Rashi again. Mincha kida'amrinan bebrachot, as we say in Mesechet Brachot. Yitzchak Avinu tikain tfilat mincha. Yitzchak established mincha. Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach basadeh. This was last week's parsha. This past week's parsha. Yitzchak went out to converse in the field, lifnot erev, as it approached the evening. Okay, so says the Rashi, that shows us, because it brings a pasuk to tell us about mincha, that shows us that davening mincha is mid-deoraita, that davening mincha is biblical in nature, whereas, says Rashi, ne'ilah is only divrei sofrim. Ne'ilah is only going to be divrei sofrim. So the simple reading of this Rashi is that mincha and davening mincha is actually biblical in nature, which would mean that we have a biblical commandment, seemingly, to daven shacharis and to daven mincha. Davening twice a day is actually a biblical commandment. So some people will say, those who want to defend the Rambam will say, no, you're misunderstanding this Rashi. When did Rashi mean that mincha is deoraita? If you never davened shacharis, right? Says the Kiryat Sefer in source number 8, no, when the Gemara said, when Rashi said and understood the Gemara to say that mincha is deoraita, that wasn't if you've already davened. If you hadn't yet davened shacharit, so then davening mincha is deoraita. Why? Because you need to daven once a day. But that's how the Kiryat Sefer, but that's not the simple understanding of Rashi. The simple understanding of Rashi is that Gemara in Brachot that tells us that we learn the tefillot from the avot. What is it telling us? It's telling us that each of those tefillot are biblical in nature, and therefore mincha is biblical in nature. Okay? And this is what Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlau understands in Rav Saji Gaon. If you look at source number 8, I quoted you the mitzvah that Rav Saji Gaon mentions. Again, Rav Saji Gaon, who was a philosopher and he was also a linguist, he writes his Sefer HaMitzvot in like almost poetic form. He doesn't like list them and say mitzvah aleph, not like the Rambam, which was very organized. Mitzvah aleph is this. He wrote it's almost like a poem. And every line refers to a mitzvah. So the second mitzvah that the Rav Saji Gaon brings is ve'oto ta'avod b'tfilah. You should serve him in tfilah. Comes Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlu and writes an extremely long essay trying to understand what does that mean. How many times do you need to daven according to the Rav Saji Gaon? What is the text? What's the oraita? What's the rabbanan? And that's what he goes and he has an entire analysis. But first, he quotes the Rambam and he rejects the Rambam. He questions the Rambam. First, Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlu quotes the Rambam. And what does he say in the Rambam? He says the Rambam thinks the mitzvah is only to daven once a day. Where does the Rambam get that from? So he quotes the opinion that says it came from the fact that it's connected to getting food. And how often do we eat? Once a day. Says Rav Yerucham Fishel Perlu, I don't understand. Who eats once a day? Look at the second paragraph. Look at the second paragraph. Not only that, by the way, he brings a proof that halachically you're supposed to eat more than once a day. You'll see it in the second. Ulefize, we're in the second paragraph. The first paragraph, he quotes the Rambam. Second paragraph, ulefize yesh litmoa. He says, wait a second. This doesn't make, according to the Rambam's logic, if that's the reason why he says it, that it's based on eating, that the pasuk that connects us to eating, we have to ask a question. We should be able to learn more than one time from that pasuk. Why? Because if you look at skip to the underlined part, imkain havele lemelef mehachkra The mitzvah min haTorah hi litpalel lo pachot mishnei pa'amim. If you're going to connect it to eating, then the Rambam should have concluded that there is a mitzvah to daven at least twice a day. Biyom, pa'amayim bayom, achat shacharit, ad arba sha'ot ad hayom, once the first 4 hours of the day, tizehu zman su'udat kol adam baboker, because that is the morning, and then of course, again at night. Again, v'hashniya bizman su'udat arvit, the next underlined part, Shekain hu darkan shel adam. We're in the second underlined part in the second paragraph. This is what people do, says Rav Yochanan Fischel Perlo. Shel kol adam le'echol shtei su'udot b'kol yom. What do people usually do? They eat twice a day. So if your logic is based on comparing it to how often we eat, we should have the obligation biblically to daven twice a day. Where does he get it that it's only once a day? And then he adds even something more. He says, I'll tell you how I know that you're supposed to eat twice a day. Because there is a Mishnah in Sukkah. The Mishnah in Sukkah talks about how many meals does a person need to eat in the Sukkah. And the Mishnah says explicitly that according to the opinion, there's a machlokes, do you have to eat only the first night in the Sukkah? Or do you have, biblically, or all 7 days? And according to the opinion that says you have to eat all 7 days, it says how many meals do you need to eat in the Sukkah? 14 meals. Which means that halachically, how often is a person, when we talk about halachic meals, meaning on Yom Tov, or on how often are you supposed to eat? You're supposed to have 2 meals a day. 2 meals a day, once in the evening and once at night. And therefore, says Rav Perlo, sorry, what did I say? Thank you. Once at night, and once in the evening, and once in the morning. And therefore, okay, yes. What do you mean? So good. So then Rav Perlo takes this a step further and says, well, based on this logic, if it's all based on connecting it to the pasuk, so then what happens on Shabbos? On Shabbos, you have 3 times a day. So maybe you should be obligated to daven 3 times a day. And then he actually says, you know what? There are some people who say that the Tefila of Musaf is actually biblical in nature. Why would that be? He says, maybe it's because of this idea that on Shabbos you're supposed to eat 3 times a day. And there are some who say on Yom Tov you should eat more. So meaning what Perlo is pointing out is that the second you compare or you suggest that the Rambam's logic is based on a connection to the pasuk of when you eat, it becomes a little bit complicated. Because then the question becomes, well, what happens when you're supposed to eat 3 times a day? Or what happens on a fast day? Does that mean you don't have to daven on a fast day because you don't have to eat? So again, the simple answer to this, to all of his questions for the Rambam, if we were trying to defend the Rambam, what would we suggest? We're talking about a regular day of a regular person. It's not that every single day your obligation to daven is going to depend on, well, that day, how many times are you going to eat, right? Because when you're younger and you're eating more, does that mean you have to daven? No. The Rambam was just trying to use parameters. And the parameter was, if we compare it to the pasuk of eating, most people, in order to function, need a minimum of eating 1 time a day. And that's where the Rambam got it from. But Rav Perlo is taking this in a different direction and saying, well, again, depending how far you want to take the comparison. Okay? So that's just, again, that's Rav Yochanan. But then he says, I'll give you another defense of the Rambam. Maybe the Rambam got 1 time a day because he compares it to, we saw this earlier, this was actually Rav Perlo who said this, compares it to Talmud Torah, right? We said that the pasuk refers to learning Torah earlier in the pasuk, and then later it talks about davening. Maybe the comparison, just like you have to learn every single day, so to you daven every single day. Says Rav Perlo, that also doesn't fit in well, because actually if you look through the sources, there actually is an obligation to learn how many times a day? Twice a day. The obligation, the fundamental obligation for a person to learn Torah is once in the morning and once in the evening. You guys are all set, because what most people don't realize is that your Yotze that by saying, what's the minimum type of learning we can do on a daily basis? Saying the Kriyat Shema. When we say Shema in the morning, and those of us who say Shema either at night in Mariv or before we go to sleep, you've at least fulfilled the obligation of minimal. But says Rav Perlo, again, the Rambam doesn't make sense. If it's based on learning, it should be twice a day. And therefore, you should be obligated twice a day. So therefore, Rav Perlo leaves all of these as questions on the Rambam, and he ends with the following paragraph. If we skip to the last paragraph, where he now explains his understanding of how often a person needs to daven biblically. And this is how he thinks Rav Saadia Gaon understands. Aval kol zeh hu rak ledat harambam v'siyato. Everything I've been saying until now, says Rav Perlo, was all according to the Rambam, who thought it was once a day. Aval ledat Rabbeinu HaGaon Zal, according to Rabbeinu, which is in reference to Rav Saadia Gaon, disvira le Digam minyan hatfilot v'gam zmane hatfilot min haTorah. That is not just the obligation to daven is once a day, but the amount is also. Nira lomar b'pshitut dinafkalan midekarya rachmana letfila avoda. Where does Rav Gaon get the idea? For those of you who don't know where we are, I apologize. We're in source number 8, the final paragraph. The final paragraph, the first couple of lines. Source number 8, the final paragraph. According to Rav Gaon, where does he know that, how often you need to daven? It's because Rav Gaon, in the way that he phrased the mitzvah was, Oto ta'avod b'tfila. You should serve Hashem with tefillah. Says Rav Gaon, what does it mean, Oto ta'avod? Why does Rav Gaon use the word ta'avod? What does avodah refer to? Serving Hashem. It also refers to a reference to korbanot. How many korbanot were brought on a daily basis, fundamentally? Two, at least two, right? We always knew two. There was the karban tamid was brought in the morning, what's called the tamid shel shachar, and the tamid shel ben harbayim, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. And therefore, says Rav Perlow, because that's what the Rav Gaon compares it to the korbanot, it must be, he concludes, that there is a mitzvah to daven twice a day. Look at the second underline, in the last paragraph, the second underline part. Kevan de avoda noheget shacharit ve'arvit. Since the avoda that Rav Gaon compares it to happens in the morning and happens in the evening, dehayinu hatmidim, referring to the tamid shel shachar and the tamid shel ben harbayim, hachanami chovat hatfila min haTorah. So too, the obligation to daven biblically, he kizmane tamid shel shacharit v'tamid shel ben harbayim. And therefore, the obligation is to daven is twice a day, once in the morning and once in the afternoon. And that, says Rav Perlow, is the opinion of Rav Gaon. So what we've seen today is, what we've seen right now is that according to this opinion, we've seen one opinion that says you only have to daven once a day biblically. The second opinion says, no, you need to daven twice a day, mid-Dorisa, even according to the Torah. And that's the conclusion of Rav Perlow according to Rav Gaon. Believe it or not, there are even those who suggest that really we have to daven 3 times a day, biblically, even mid-Dorisa. Now, where does that come from? So first, it comes from a couple of interesting psukim in Tanakh that seem to reference davening 3 times a day. If you look at source number 9, in Tehillim, Sefer Tehillim, the pasuk says in Tehillim, David HaMelech says, Erev vavoker v'tzaharayim asicha ve'ehemeh vayishma koli. Morning, or evening, morning and afternoon, I converse and I reach out to you, and he listens to my voice. Says Rashi, what is this a reference to? Sorry, do I have the numbers wrong? Or are we good? Oh, okay. Sorry? Okay, the bottom of the page. Says Rashi, what is this a reference to? Erev vavoker v'tzaharayim, arvit, shacharit, umincha, gimel tefillah. It's a reference to davening 3 times a day. So already within Sefer Tehillim, David HaMelech seems to reference the idea of davening 3 times a day. Where else in Tanakh do we see this idea of davening 3 times a day? We actually see it in Sefer Daniel. In the story of Sefer Daniel, the Navi tells us that Daniel himself, how often would he daven? He davened 3 times a day. It's written in Aramaic, so bear with me. We'll read the words inside. I think it's always good to see the source. But this is now number 10. Source number 10. Vidaniel ki yeda dirishim ktava. When Daniel realized that some kind of decree was being written, we're not going to get into the details of it. Al levete, he went up to his house. V'kavein ptichan le be'ilite neged Yerushalayim, and he faced his body towards Yerushalayim. This is also one of the earliest sources for the idea that when you daven, you should daven towards Yerushalayim. V'zimnin tlasa biyoma, and 3 times a day, hu barech al birkoi, he would go down on his knees, umitzalei umodeh kadam elokei, kol kavel di hava aved min kadmat nei, and that he would daven to Hashem and thank him and request for all the things that he wanted. So already, 1 second, I'll take your question in a second. We see, and Rashi says, what does it mean, zimnin tlasa 3 times a day? Look at the Rashi in source number 10, arvit, shacharit, and mincha. So we have already 2 references in Tanakh for this idea that we're davening 3 times a day. Yes. The first was in Tehillim, and the second is Daniel.
But I learned that after, when Nach started, after Moshe Rabbeinu, there were no more halachas that were from the Torah that were given. So you would have to say that that Daniel and David HaMelech had learned this from some
Correct.
Torah.
Very good. Correct. You are 100% correct. And in fact, these aren't clear sources, because you could look at these psukim and say, this is what they did. This is what they did. They daven 3 times a day, but that doesn't mean that that's binding for us midoraisa. Okay? So what these are, what you could also call, is what you would call an asmachta. Once, according to those who are going to argue and say, no, the 3 times a day is not biblical, it's rabbinic in nature. What that means is the rabbis interpreted 3 times a day. Maybe they got it. Maybe where did they get 3 times from? Maybe they used the pasuk in Tehillim and the pasuk in Daniel to show, well, what would be a logical amount of time? See what Daniel did. See what David HaMelech did. So you're 100% correct. The source here is not foolproof, and that's why many disagree. But what's interesting is you look at source number 11, where the Gemara does seem to suggest that we're learning it from these psukim. Source number 11 is the Gemara in Brachos. Says the Gemara, Yachol yitpalel adam kol hayom kulo. You might have thought that a person should daven all day, all the time. Kivar mifurash al yedei Daniel v'zimnin tlasa. We already see from Daniel, we have a model from Daniel that you should do it 3 times a day, lo lagzim, as they say here in Israel, right? You don't have to. Now, again, anyone who is going through a specific part and wants to daven more, you're welcome to, but it's not our obligation. Our obligation is 3 times a day. Continues the Gemara. Again, I skipped parts of the Gemara that weren't relevant. Yachol yehe kolilan bevat achat. You might have thought, okay, so I have to do 3 tefillah, but let me say them all at once. Like, right, if it's all about just saying the 3 tefillah, so let me get up in the morning, say Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv all at once, right? Have you ever had that before? Where like you finish Shachris and the guys want to start Mincha right away, right? Okay, so let's just say check off the box. With Mincha and Mariv, we do for practical reasons, and it's a very good point, and we'll get to that when we talk about the 3 times a day, because that's not what was initially intended, but then you also have to deal with practical realities. But yes, correct. Says the Gemara, you might have thought you should do it all at once. Daven the three davenings all together. Kvar mifurash al yedei David. It says by David HaMelech erev vavoker v'tzaharayim, which tells us that these 3 davenings should be 3 times a day. So you could understand this Gemara to be telling you that these are the actual source for 3 times, which would mean that this is biblical in nature. But we could also look at this and say, no, all the Gemara is telling me is once we've already know midrabanan that we have to do it 3 times a day, it's what's called an asmachta. We're connecting it to a pasuk. Sometimes the rabbis will institute certain things, and they'll find a pasuk in Tanakh to connect it to show the reference to it, even if it's not actually midoraisa in nature. Okay, so what we've seen here is that if you look at those psukim, you could argue that it is midoraisa. The other support for suggesting that 3 times a day is midoraisa is actually the Rashi we saw earlier. We saw earlier when we were discussing the opinion that says 2 times a day. So Rashi, we quoted a Rashi, then Rashi quoted the pasuk that says mincha is deoraisa. Why? Based on who? Who David? Mincha? Yitzchak. Some Mefarshim point out that's true. We understood that to mean, okay, so Rashi says mincha is deoraisa. If you take that Rashi all the way, if Rashi thinks that the pasuk by Yitzchak was telling us that mincha is deoraisa, then Rashi would also agree that the pasuk by Yaakov, there's also a pasuk by Yaakov. What does the pasuk by Yaakov say? Vayashkema erev, and he. Forgive me if I don't get the word. No, I think it's vayifgosh, vayifga b'makom, and that refers to Yaakov. So if you're going to mean Rashi was only talking about mincha because the Gemara was only talking about mincha, but if you take that Rashi and you take his logic all the way, what Rashi was really saying was, all of those psukim are references to a biblical commandment, midoraisa, in which case, since there is a pasuk for ma'ariv by Yaakov, that would mean that maybe you have to daven midoraisa 3 times a day. So there are those who want to suggest that maybe there is a biblical obligation 3 times a day. What would be the main basis for that? It would be the psukim that we just quoted. And the other basis would be the Gemara in Brachot. The Gemara in Brachot, I brought it for you here in source number 12. I'm not going to go through it again, because I want to give you some time to have a bit of a break before the next class. But what the Gemara in Brachot mentions is the avot were each mitakein a different tefillah, and it quotes a pasuk for each of them. You could interpret that to mean that therefore they're all it's midoraisa to daven 3 times a day, or you could interpret that to just mean the obligation to daven 3 times a day is rabbinic, but we're connecting it to the avot. Okay, so again, we did, like I said, I apologize for those of you who weren't able to stay with us today. It was a bit of a technical shi'ur, But really, in my mind, the goal is to get us from a place of where do we get davening is biblical to understanding what we're doing today. What we saw that last week we discussed a machloket, whether or not there is a mitzvah Dorisa, there is a biblical obligation to daven. Today, we discussed if there is, which most people assume there is, not like the Ramban, most assume like the Rambam, there is a biblical obligation to daven to HaKadosh Baruch Hu on a daily basis. How many times a day does that obligation exist biblically? We saw that according to the Rambam, and by the way, this is what most people agree. Most poskim agree that midaraisa, it's like the Rambam, that you have to daven one time a day, like the Rambam suggests. We saw different explanations for where the Rambam would have gotten that from. It could be logic. Could be based on the connection to how often a person eats. It could be based on the connection to how often a person is meant to daven. We saw that those proofs are not foolproof because if it's based on how you eat, we eat more than one time a day, right? And we saw of Yerucham Fishel Perla, who suggests that the opinion of Rasadia Gaon, that the davening is not one time a day, but really, biblically, you need to daven 2 times a day, Shacharis and Mincha. And that's how he understands Rav Sadia Gaon, based on the fact that he connects it to Korbanot. Since there were 2 Korbanot that were done on a daily basis, so too the davening is twice a day. And then we also saw potential indications, although it's not a strong argument, that maybe the commandment to daven 3 times a day is actually biblical in nature, midoraisa. And as I mentioned, the main opinion, the mainstream approach is that the commandment to daven, that midoraisa, a person only needs to daven 1 time a day. That's midoraisa. What we're going to see next week is where we got to 3 times. If we assume like the Rambam, which is what most people assume, that the Rambam, that it's the obligation to daven midoraisa is only 1 time a day. We're going to see how we got to 3 times a day, which is some of what we've done already, but to review that again, and also to see from a hashkafic perspective the significance of doing it morning, afternoon, and evening. Yes, one question before we. Absolutely. Correct. Is that significant davening? So the question he's asking, and again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's an interesting question. I think the question he's asking is there a lot of discussion about how davening should be done? And he compared it to trains and bullet trains. So you have the davening, and then you have the bullet train davening, which goes fast. So I think the easiest way to explain that is there a value to that davening? I do believe there is. Do I believe that is the most ideal form of davening? I think we all would agree that that's not necessarily the most ideal form of davening. But again, davening is a personal thing. This is the challenge of davening. It's personal, it's shibboleth, but it also has a very public communal aspect to it. And finding that right balance between the needs of the community or balancing different people's individual needs is a challenge. Because there are some people who would say, no, I can't, I'm just throwing this out there. There are some people, I know many people who say, I need to daven fast because I can't concentrate more than that. And I respect that. For me personally, it takes more time. I need to think more in order to be able to. But the idea of what's better or what's worse, that's why on some level, obviously, when we talk about what Corona was obviously a tragedy and a challenge for many different people. But there were some people who actually said that they felt that their davening, where they were forced to daven by themselves and not with a minyan, sometimes was more meaningful. Does that mean we should always daven by yourselves and not with a minyan? No. We believe, certainly for the men, there's an obligation, there's a value. We're going to get to why that is, why davening b'tzibur is more powerful. But you have to find that balance. The halacha that definitely says a person should be mitkaven, should have kavana for davening. That is a halachic aspect of davening. What is kavana and how a person can best have kavana, I think is individual in nature, but at the same time, you have to have it. By the way, again, I'll throw that out there. Just when we talk about how long davening should be, it's very, very tricky. There are some minyanim, and there are some minyanim that go very fast, some that go slow. To me, the most important thing in a minyan is you need to have something uniform. So if someone walks into davening, they know this is the minyan that davens quickly, and this is the minyan that davens fast. So then you can decide what's meaningful. I think the challenge becomes when you have some minyanim that, depending on who gets up there to daven, you never know what you're going to get. That I think can be a challenge, and that's why I personally prefer. If there's a meeting that goes fast because people have to get to work and people have to get here, I respect that, and I don't think that's our place to necessarily, because there are some people who a quicker davening might be more meaningful for them because they can't concentrate. But I think the challenge becomes not knowing what you're going to get when you get up there in the morning. You get up to davening, you're like, okay, what's going to be today? What do I need to do? Do I need to start by skipping? Do I have time? So I think it's a very, very good question. But I think certainly as a Rav and as a leader, and I think all of us need to remember that when we're dealing with communal aspects, there are different, as they say, different strokes for different folks. And that's very important, because on the one hand, there is a halacha that you have to have kavanah. What constitutes kavanah? And the best way to have kavanah, I think we would all agree, the more we prepare, the more we learn about, the more effort we put into it, then our davening will be more meaningful. That doesn't necessarily have to translate into a longer davening. I think that'll depend.
And isn't there something about not stressing the community? In other words, you can't.
There is a concept of what's called there's called tircha de tzibura, that you're not supposed to cross a tircha. But again, that depends on the tzibur. Different tziburs will have different definitions, and that's why you need to, as a community, come to certain. Okay.